What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you an observation, if anything really, of what the title more or less said, some variation of, that being Real Time with Pause is more or less dead, which is a bit of a bummer for me personally. I, of course, love CRPGs, a lot of people know the channel for that, and CRPGs usually come in one of two flavors, sometimes both, that being turn-based or Real Time with Pause. I personally have come to enjoy both. I like both of them, actually. They both certainly have their pros, their cons. I've made videos talking about exactly that in depth. I have had this conversation many times. And while I don't actually think there is a perfect solution for anyone really, because, just to give you the quick spark notes, Real Time with Pause is a harder barrier to entry for a lot of people. It simply requires a little more know-how and system knowledge than turn-based does, because turn-based is, of course, at the player's own pace, with the drawback of that being that it is inherently a little bit slower, but combine that with recent developments speeding that process up, and suddenly you've got the overall winner, which is obviously what brings us to the subject of today's video. Now, just a quick interjection there as well. As I mentioned, there are people like myself who love both. There are certainly games that have both as an option, sometimes a toggle between them, such as Wrath of the Righteous, or more recently, and kind of the reason I'm talking about this, the change to the original Pillars of Eternity, allowing you to toggle turn-based mode on or off. I like that option personally, but even I acknowledge that it's hard to balance around that kind of thing, because then you're effectively doing two different combat systems at will, and while I'm happy to mess around with that, it can create a bit of an issue for some people who simply want to do one or the other. So like I said, really no perfect solution, and yet it seems we've arrived at the solution people are going to accept, which is that turn-based is simply the winner. As I just mentioned, I was recently going through Pillars, the turn-based mode that was just added to the original game, and that unsurprisingly prompted a whole bunch of comments about, as I also just mentioned, a conversation I've had a million times, but it was on my mind. And so I decided to sit down and go back through all of my reviews for the past year and kind of take a look at how many Real Time with Pause new releases there were. And the answer was very easy to come up with, because the answer was 2 since 2023, and why I went back to 2023 in just a moment. And probably the stranger part, the 2 new release Real Time with Pause games that I've played in the last couple of years were both within the past month or so, those being Banquet for Fools and Greedfall: The Dying World. I did review other Real Time with Pause games in the last few years, but they were all older titles. I also recently made a video talking about all of the upcoming CRPGs and stuff I was looking forward to, and there aren't really any Real Time with Pause games on the horizon. And so while that in and of itself is not exactly news, it's been, I would say, known, or at least observed for the past several years, that turn-based was definitely on the winning side of things. But I guess it only occurred to me very recently just how kind of bleak the landscape for Real Time with Pause has become. And while I don't think it will ever truly die, there was like a roughly 10-year period, essentially the 2000s, where CRPGs were kind of considered more or less dead, but even during that time period, there were CRPGs releasing, just not a lot of them. And I imagine Real Time with Pause is probably looking at something like that for the foreseeable future. I think we'll still get a few here and there, but I also think they're going to be pretty rare. Which kind of leads me into the reason I only went back to 2023 to check out the recent Real Time with Pause titles, which is simply, of course, because that's when Baldur's Gate 3 released. I was very curious about this in particular because when Baldur's Gate 3 released, there was a bunch of conversations people may or may not remember about the sort of effect that Baldur's Gate 3 was going to have on future development. And while I really don't think it was the cause of the, slowdown in terms of Real Time with Pause, I think one of Baldur's Gate 3's more lasting ramifications, though there will be many more than this, is kind of inadvertently being the final nail in the coffin for Real Time with Pause for the, again, foreseeable future. Now, of course, as I've already discussed, this was happening well before BG3 released. It was definitely on a downhill swing before that. Although I do think it's kind of funny that Larian in particular seems to kind of be leading the charge in moving in that direction, because both Divinity Original Sin 2, which originally released in 2017, followed up by, of course, Baldur's Gate 3, really got a lot of attention to the genre as a whole, and both of those games are heavily turn-based, and I think that played a not insignificant part in roping in new audiences, because again, turn-based is just easier for people who don't play a lot of these games. It requires less knowledge. or I should say maybe less memorized knowledge, because you don't have to, pause and give orders or anything. You can just kind of on your own time pretty easily parse what is happening. Combine that with Larian's approach for making a really curated experience with their turn-based battles that really resonates with a lot of people. And I think you can start to see why the tides have shifted in that direction. But again, I think Larian is just one piece of the puzzle there. I don't think it was just them. There have been plenty of other games. It's just easier to point to these ones as a bit of a flagpole given the very prominent releases they have put up in that regard. Another example would be like Owlcat. They, of course, did real-time with pause and turn-based with Wrath of the Righteous, but then for Rogue Trader, they fully switched over to turn-based, and then they even, after Baldur's Gate 3 release, directly talked about some of the things they wanted to move in that direction as well with, because the audience had come to expect them. Those being things like full-on voice acting and, the production values, that kind of stuff. And they've also just kind of stuck with turn-based since then. And I think overall we have found ourselves in a situation where real-time with pause has become a bit of a hard sell. So much so that real-time with pause is becoming a feature that some people just straight up will not play it. That being that there are a lot of people who just simply will not play a game that is not turn-based in this space, which is interesting because I have noticed that doesn't usually go the other direction as much. You have people like myself who will happily play real-time with pause or turn-based, and there are certainly people who strictly prefer real-time with pause, and yet I have noticed most of those people will still play a turn-based game. They might complain about it the whole time, but they'll do it. And when you start combining all of those factors together, I think that's just pretty much why you're seeing turn-based completely take over the space right now. I think eventually people might get tired of it and we might see a swing back in the other direction at some point, but for right now, I think turn-based is pretty much going to be it for, like the next 5-6 years probably. A lot of people find it easier thanks to innovations and things like tech and optimizations for that combat system. One of its main drawbacks, which is that it was fairly slow, has also started to be addressed. Shifting engines, allowing them to do more with just dynamic fields rather than flat planes as well, makes it more interesting for people to do turn-based and really think about the things they are about to set up and do. And while real-time with pause has some of that, and I actually do find that a little frustrating personally, but it's hard to get through to people on that one, because one of the things you'll see about turn-based versus real-time with pause is people will often say that turn-based battles are like more curated experiences with more mechanics and stuff. But real-time with pause definitely has like big curated battles and interesting mechanics and things like that. The issue often being that if you don't understand what you're looking at on screen, you're probably not going to understand those mechanics to, of course, address the fight properly, which then becomes a bit of a knowledge barrier, and that's probably why you prefer turn-based to begin with. But then the conveyance of all those things and your trouble with that system feed right back into this conversation. And so the bottom line, because of all of those reasons, and I'm sure more people will tell me about in the comments, turn-based just kind of won. We'll almost certainly continue to see more niche titles like Banquet for Fools was a really fun one that did real-time with pause recently, but even that game, isn't exactly some big blockbuster or anything. It's a relatively niche title. Greedfall: The Dying World was a decent enough attempt at a real-time with pause system, but truth be told, I don't feel it really added anything to it. And if we're being critical, I would go so far as to say The Dying World actually lacked a lot of features that other real-time with pause games have implemented, though given their situation with the publisher, not exactly a huge surprise. Thus, with, I would say, very few real-time with pause games in the last few years, pretty much nothing on the horizon, we find ourselves in a situation for real-time with pause where I think at most we're hoping for a situation where upcoming turn-based titles happen to have a real-time with pause option. And while that bums me out as a bit of a genre enthusiast who really wants to see that stuff continue to get made, ultimately things have to make money, and if that's not where the sales are right now, then that's not what people are going to do and make. So, as always, I will continue playing and watching what happens in the future, of course, but the future for real-time with pause is looking pretty bleak. Which, on that bright and cheery note, is exactly where I am going to leave off this particular video, and while I'm sure people will be more than happy to tell me about their preference between these two combat styles, I'd love to hear about some of your favorite games that use each. Maybe try to make this slightly more positive. It can be a little bit of a bummer to read negative comment sections for me personally, but, do you. Either way, though, that's going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.